and gentlemen, as you know, the Empire Club of Canada has had many great speakers in its 110 years of history. It is with great regret, however, that I inform you of the passing of a great world leader and former speaker of this club. She spoke here twice. The Right Honourable Margaret Thatcher, former Prime Minister of England, has passed away today. Lady Thatcher spoke at this very podium almost 40 years ago. In tribute to her, and in lieu of a moment of silence, as we know she wasn't a big fan of silence, I will read to you a quote by her, which she delivered at this very podium. It is often said that politics is the art of the possible. There is a danger in such a phrase. We may suppose impossible things which would be possible and indeed desirable if only we had more courage and more insight. I have always felt that it is the task of politicians to be 2 or 3 years in advance of public opinion, to be able to foresee dangers, to warn about them, and then to guard against them. This, it seems to me, is the essential task of a leader. Not to follow public opinion from the back, but to lead it from the front. It now gives me great pleasure to welcome our moderator for today's panel. I understand that Mr. Hume will be introducing our guest panelists, so I have the opportunity to introduce him. Christopher Hume is no stranger to the city of Toronto. Born in England, he came to Toronto as a child and has spent his career on issues of architecture and urban issues. And he's a pillar of the Toronto Star's writing staff. Christopher is someone who has received countless awards and recognition for journalism and writing. Most notably, he was awarded the very prestigious National Newspaper Award for journalism. Every respected developer in Canada vies for an endorsement from Christopher Hume in his many articles on urban affairs. Mr. Hume understands the city of Toronto. He's an expert in architecture and the history of our city's buildings and the many stories behind them. Christopher Hume is a huge advocate for a vertical city and tackling the issues of mass transit and gridlock to further improve urban life. Recently, in an article that he wrote, he was quoted as saying, "Before the condo, Toronto was a big town. Now, it's a city." Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to invite Mr. Christopher Hume to the podium.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, I can tell you that. As I said in the book there, the sun never sets on the Empire Club. It might set on others. And you know, it was Margaret Thatcher, the very one who spoke here twice. Can you hear me? Who spoke here twice and who died today, who is supposed to have said at some point in her illustrious career, excuse me, that any man over the age of 26 who still takes public transit can count himself a failure. It's kind of an interesting way to think about this idea of the vertical city. And as far as I know, as far as I'm concerned, the vertical city, what we call the vertical city, is another way of describing an enormous change that is sweeping across not just North America, but I think the world. And you know, it was the United Nations who told us in 2006 that for the first time in human history, more of us now live in cities than don't. And this phenomenon is playing out for the most part in Asia and places like sub-Saharan Africa with dire consequences. But it's also a fact of life here. And I've got a few, I picked out a few facts and figures, something which I normally avoid as a journalist, as you know. But I thought maybe they'd be useful here today. You probably know a lot of this stuff. There was a study released a little while ago about the number of high-rises under construction in this continent. Toronto came out well ahead of the rest of the pack. There are 132 high-rises under construction in this city, the vast bulk of them, of course, condos. Next on the list was Mexico City with 88, New York, a paltry 86. The next one after that was Chicago, way down the list at 17. No wonder we just overtook them as we are now the fourth largest city in America. And the TD Bank, and I refer to their study before I even knew that they were the sponsor today, has released more facts and figures. And basically, what's happening is that growth in the city has, after many decades, overtaken growth in the 905. I could go on reading more figures here. Since 2009, 4.7 million square feet of office space has been constructed in Toronto compared to 3.9 million in the 905. Since 2000, I find this an amazing statistic, 50,000 condo units have been built, sold, and occupied south of Bloor Street, 50,000. And as of 2011, another 90,000 have been approved. And you know, condos have become, as I often say, the new C word. People don't like condos, and they think of them as, condo has become shorthand for tall, ugly building. But I think there's a lot more to the story than that. I think, as I was quoted as saying, it's the condo that will allow Toronto to become a city, something it has wanted to do, overtly or not, for some time. But we have failed to keep pace with ourselves here in the city. And I'm not going to go on and on about that because I think our panelists will do a much better job. But as I say, I think that we have to understand this issue of the vertical city not just as an issue of how tall is a building, how tall can buildings be, but as a harbinger of a new way of living. And as an embrace of urbanity and of the city and of density in a way that we've never seen before. Indeed, until recently, there has been a flight away from the downtown, away from the city. The whole history of post-war urbanism is about this flight from the city to the suburbs. And before I invite the panelists up, I just want to speak also a little bit about the other side of this density coin, which of course is the car. Other figures now tell us that the use of the car in North America has peaked. And in fact, that car use in terms of the number of drives and the distances of drives is going down. And this is after decades and decades of steady growth. And of course, who isn't driving? Well, it's the young people. It's the echo generation. I hate that term, but they're the people who were born between 72 and 92, young people, and a lot of them, interestingly, raised in the suburbs. And as soon as they get an opportunity, they head straight downtown, and they're, of course, the demographic that is fueling this condo boom. And I think the question that one of the questions we have to wonder about, because, you know, these people are not interested, as my generation was, and I guess is, in owning a car as soon as you get the opportunity. They want to put their money in other things, probably iPhones and condos, I don't know what. But if you live in an urban setting, you don't need a car. And I'm living proof of that, because like Paul Bedford, who's also on our panel, I don't drive. And I can live, at least by my modest standards, a full and rich life without access to a vehicle. You might disagree. But in any case, as I say, we're on the cusp of this enormous change. And it bodes well for the downtown, perhaps not so well for the Mississaugas of the world, regardless of what happens to Hales and McCallion. But before we go any further, I guess what we should do is bring up our panelists, and I'll briefly introduce them. I'm sitting here, so I'm close to the lectern, okay, that's all. On my left here, Blake Hutcheson, who is the president and CEO of Oxford Properties, which runs tens of billions of dollars worth of real estate throughout the world, 10 or 20 billion of it, I've forgotten, 20. 10 billion dollars worth of property here in Toronto. That would buy at least a couple of condo units. Paul Bedford, my old friend, is a former chief planner here in the city of Toronto, an outspoken advocate for urbanism, and a professor at the U of T and at Ryerson. Finally, Steve Diamond, another old friend. You all know Steve, of course, as a real estate municipal lawyer. Now runs Diamond Corporation, a new developer here in the city, a city wealthy and rich and deep in developers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a few questions to get the conversation going, and then maybe what we can do is open it up, and I'm sure you'll have lots of insightful remarks and comments and questions to ask our panel. Who should I start off with? I think maybe Paul. Paul, we're here today to talk about this growing gap between what the city has become and the infrastructure necessary to support what the city has become. And I guess one of the main considerations there is transit. How big is that gap?
Well, can everybody hear me? This thing's on? Okay. Well, I think just a couple of corrections, Chris. My number is 189 high-rises under construction in the city now. You're right on the Toronto number one. We're way ahead of everybody. And everyone knows that, you know, we're going through a totally different phase in our city. I have no problem at all with density, good density, because density makes a successful city. But it has to have a positive, supportive public realm and public infrastructure to make it work. And that's, to me, the elements of the gap. And I think you know, it's been said by many people, including me, that Toronto has a great public transit system for 1 million people. Only trouble is we got 6 million. And the reality is we know we're so far behind. So that's number one, public transit. I'll have a lot more to say about that. And I believe just up the street, the Premier right now is speaking to the Board of Trade about her thoughts on this very topic. So it's absolutely critical. The second is the public realm. It's all of the ingredients that we all associate with making complete communities, good neighborhoods, good quality of life that has to be provided to support this new city and this new density. Now in the downtown core, and I'm talking about, you know, not only the public realm in terms of the streets, the parks, the open spaces, public squares, schools, libraries, community centers, all that stuff that makes civilized life possible. But I think one of the problems we've got now, and you've alluded to this in your comments about the car ownership rate, you know, 45% of all the people living in the downtown core walk to work now because it's easier, faster, simpler, et cetera, et cetera. And the reality is that we need to take some critical decisions, like, and I'll give you a couple of examples that have been made, to widen the public sidewalks for the volume of pedestrian traffic. And whether it's Yonge Street or King Street, or we've all walked, I think, on Bloor Street to see what's happened up there. So many, many issues there, but clearly we have a huge gap.
Steve, as a developer, has infrastructure become an issue that you feel you have to deal with? Do your customers ask about accessibility of public transit and that sort of thing? Is it an issue for them?
I think that it's becoming more and more in the number one issue. People love the City of Toronto. It's clear by the growth that we're getting in the City of Toronto. But if there's one area, and it's not only the customers, it's become the biggest issue when you go to talk to residents in a community today. They seem to be, and maybe we've graduated a bit over the issue of height, but everyone's wondering about how we're going to accommodate people living in terms of the infrastructure and the transportation that's taking place in the city. That's the big gap. I mean, even the roads, the Gardiner is falling apart. I mean, what are we going to do about that in the future? What are we going to do about getting more transportation and more subways built? And it is definitely an issue that we have to address. What I find, most interesting is to try to go behind some of these issues and try to figure out why are we struggling today with getting infrastructure built? Why was it in the 1970s when I was a kid that there was money for infrastructure? What's been happening since that point in time? And it's not really part of a land use issue, but I remember asking Greg Sabera what's gone on in my lifetime, and he basically said that when I was 18 years old, we paid 18 cents of a tax dollar to healthcare. Today we're paying 52 cents of our dollars to, and that was last year or so, to healthcare. So in terms of looking at the future, it's no wonder that our governments are struggling, and it's no wonder that we need to look to other revenue tools in order to replace the infrastructure that's occurring in the city.
I want to come back to that issue of revenue tools too, because people say that we pay too much in tax, but clearly we're not paying enough. If we can't cover the costs of the things, the goods and services we expect from government, what alternative is there but to pay more tax?
Well, we have to, as a society, recognize that nothing is for free. And my view is that we have to all recognize that there's a burden that we all have to pay in moving forward. I mean, in the City of Toronto, even our property tax rates are generally pretty gentle compared to when you leave the City of Toronto, and I think Blake can elaborate, but the office space in the city carries a huge proportion of the burden of the taxes, and our residents don't really appreciate the break that they're getting in terms of the fact that there are these taxes underway. If we want to live in a civilized society, if we're going to live in a place where we're going to have a really healthy and vibrant downtown, and we are so lucky in the City of Toronto to have what we have in the downtown, one of the most vibrant downtowns maybe anywhere in the world, but I think as a community, we have to exercise some sense of individual responsibility and face up to the fact that we're going to have to pay for it, and nothing's for free.
Blake, do you want to pick up on that?
If you're going to keep talking about more taxes, I'm going to go to a vertical tasting down the hall instead of a vertical. I think there's no question the biggest issue that faces us today is transportation, and there's no question we got to get our arms around it, and there's no question there's room for some incremental user fees, tools, however you choose, however you want to term it. I think the real question, though, is who do you exact the pain on, and can you not be more efficient in certain ways instead of just saying the only solution is this out? And, it's interesting, the Board of Trade, who we all support, the commercial community all supported, came out with a study recently, and it was 5 or 8 incremental exactions on the very people that are making this city happen, making the city work, as opposed to choosing a few carefully. And the single biggest one was this new parking tax. And they said, by the way, we think there should be a parking tax. It should only be on commercial real estate. And that's the goal. That's what's going to take you to the promised land. Everyone's afraid to put it on a parking space for residential. Why? Because residential people vote and commercial people don't. And today in this city, we pay the highest tax. Everybody in this room, if you occupy 1 square foot of office space, you pay the highest tax in the world, even after exchange differentials, for an occupancy cost. And it doesn't affect the developers as much as you think, because it's a pass-through, but it is putting a huge bit of pain on any working people in the city.
So why are office construction rates going up? Why are people moving back into the city? Why do people want to be
Totally
here?
valid. First of all, we got the greatest country in the world, and we have a pretty sizable company. In this city alone, we have roughly $10 billion of real estate, including Yorkdale, with partners, including 23 office buildings in Toronto. And so we're investing in London, we're investing in New York, we're investing elsewhere. This is an unbelievable city. And the American dream is to live and work in the suburbs, has been. And the Canadian dream has been to live and work downtown. And we've had safe cities, and we've invested enough in infrastructure, and commercial real estate in downtown Toronto versus any other spot in the US and elsewhere, price per square foot is either valued higher or close to, with the exception of a few pockets in New York. For years, the suburban office product in America was very high priced compared to downtown, and that's flipping because people naturally want to gravitate towards cities. And it's the same comment you made earlier. And if there's anything that's going on in the world, it's the death of the suburbs. Gas is too expensive. The dream of living in the suburbs, while idyllic at the time, has disappeared. You know, you're not playing road hockey because everyone's got a virtual life. You have to drive to the mall to get milk. And so you're seeing a massive migration to these cities. You'll see a massive migration to Toronto. And Toronto can be one of the greatest cities in the world.
I think that we've heard it from the horse's mouth. This is not just a far-fetched idea dreamed up by somebody from the Toronto Star, which some of my friends have accused of being communist. This is something that's actually happening. But you know, there's another side to this, and Paul, maybe you can talk about that. This exodus into the city, this flight away from car dependency is great news for the downtown core. But what's the significance for Mississauga or Milton or any one of those places that we know of out there?
Well, I think the issue, Blake touched on it for sure, is that, you know, people value their time, and the commute is getting longer and longer and longer. And I think the figure Metrolink cites is 82 minutes is the average commute in this region now, which is way ahead of Los Angeles. And that's only going to get worse if we don't invest in a transportation network that we need. And I think that from the people that I am aware of and who live in the suburbs and I've known for a long time, you know, they went to the suburbs with the American dream idea, and it was okay for a while, but now it's starting to fray at the edges because of the long commute, because of the cost of gas, because of all these other factors that are working together. I don't think the suburbs are going away, don't get me wrong, but I just think that the reality is that if you build car-dependent places, which most of suburban North America really are, the reality is you can't build your way out of gridlock because those car-dependent places just get worse and worse, and you get to the level of congestion where, you know, everything starts falling apart. There's one last comment. There's a website some of you guys may have seen called deadmalls.com. Go to it.
We own
it's
one.
Fascinating. Yeah. And there are more and more and more of those happening that need to be repositioned and rethought. So I think the whole rethinking of the suburbs is one of the biggest issues facing us.
I'm just going to interject one comment. The real estate's not going away.
No.
And this suburban product isn't going away. But by the way, the values are. Values there relative to downtown dissipate. It was a really nice experiment, you know, post-Second World War, this suburban life. And it's a nice try. But that's the future's in the cities.
Is that right, Steve?
Well, it's fascinating. We were looking at statistics this morning that over the last 12 years, we've been building about 40,000 housing units, the same amount every year. Yet, since 2006, when the growth plan and the Greenbelt came into effect, there was actually a dramatic change in that distribution of the housing units. And where in the year 2000, a vast majority were low-rise units outside of the city or the downtown, today we have the majority of units being high-rise, a much greater proportion, and the low-rise segment has diminished. There has been a dramatic shift in people's lifestyle and choices over the last 6 or 7 years. And that has resulted in a large number of additional benefits that we've been discussing here this morning in the downtown. Now that people are living downtown, the labor market is downtown. And with the labor market being downtown, it's encouraging more office development downtown. And I also believe that the next generation is making the decision that they don't want to commute. And they would prefer to live potentially in a smaller unit. I even believe that that the next stage is going to be, there's going to be a generational change and families will start to live in mid-rise and high-rise buildings in this city because they want to live in a stimulating, vibrant environment and be close to work. And there has just been, it's actually surprising in my lifetime this transformation has taken place.
Paul.
Yeah, I want to pick up on a couple of things Steve said. Number one about mid-rise. We've been talking about sort of low-rise, townhouse, single-family markets of the past and obviously vertical living. But there's another market, which is the mid-rise. That's just starting to come into its own. And that's on our arterials and our main streets, and it's an old idea. There's nothing new about it. But the reality is it started to take hold. And one of the things that I think is very attractive about mid-rise, and I'm talking 6 to 10 stories, you know, with the retail at grade, that sort of thing, is that it makes a better street. When you, instead of having these 1-story or 2-story buildings on these main streets, to have mid-rise buildings with lots of life and more people supporting shopkeepers, using the transit, et cetera, it's a win-win-win story. And developers that I know are now looking at that much more seriously than they ever have. In fact, I looked at the City of Toronto's data recently, and despite all of the development that's happened in the central area and the downtown core, about, I think the figure was almost surprised me, I think it was 29 or 30% of all the new units that you talked about have been already built or proposed on the main streets. And that figure is going up and up and up. There's one last piece of this that is going to come out very shortly, which is to amend the Ontario Building Code. It's a proposal to allow wood frame construction up to 6 stories. Now you can only go to 4. British Columbia did that a few years ago and has resulted in a huge spike. If you've been to Vancouver lately on West 4th and Broadway and all those main streets, all of that mid-rise stuff. So that's another component that's coming.
There's 2 points they made I think it's important people hear. 40,000 units for 15 years gets built in the GTA. You got 100,000 net migrants, 40,000 units. It used to be the shift was roughly 30,000 single family, 10,000 high rise, and that's flip-flop. Trades can handle 40,000 units, the market can absorb 40,000 units, and that has been why when we all look at those cranes and say, how can this be sustainable? The underlying mathematics explain why we have so many cranes in the sky. So if we all hit the panic button and say this is too much, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The reality is it isn't too much. It can be sustained, provided we don't panic at the same time. And I think it's a key point. And I think, sure, there are 180 units in Mexico, has however many you said. You know, 6 buildings in New York are 190 units with the height. And when you do have a mix of mid-rise and reasonable sized product in the city, the 180 isn't the way to compare it. It's the units from one city to the next.
Well, let's talk about units, because one of the criticisms that we hear often is that the units are too small to sustain a market that will eventually want to have kids and raise their kids in high rises. Are we providing for this future use adequately?
It's a great point. I think it's the next level that's going to be addressed. I've said to people that we're not creating too many housing units. We may, in the last few years, created too many smaller units. But having said that, if there's going to be a change, then governments have to wake up and start realizing that it's a matter of economics. And the same way that they use economic tools to stimulate other forms of development or construction, they have to start looking at ways to stimulate and make it more economical to build larger units. The smaller units came in when they added the HST, and everyone wanted to build below a certain level. There's the land transfer tax. But the city has development charges, and I've often said maybe they should be charging more for a 1-bedroom and less for a 3-bedroom than the other way around. Whether that would work or not, I haven't done the complete analysis. But there's tax incremental financing that they use for different reasons. There's the potential for the wood frame construction to create more economical units. I think that most cities in the world, in their core, there are families living in them. We are the exception. I think we're going to go there. I think the developers that figure that out are going to make money. and I think the governments have to be looking at the issue at the same time.
But I want to ask Paul, you know, you think about housing in Toronto. It was built at a certain time to meet certain social conditions and expectations. A generation later, a large house is carved up into apartments, and then this happens and that happens. Isn't there a way that the planning regime can reflect and build into condo construction a certain flexibility so that, for example, in the future, you might buy the unit beside you and expand or knock down a wall? I hear people talking about how impossible shear walls make that to happen. Why don't we set up a regime where those things are made illegal and we build maximum flexibility, resilience into condos? It seems to be not something that we ever talk about.
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent point. I'm sure Steve wants to add to that, but I think one of the amazing things about the Toronto housing stock is its convertibility back and forth, in terms of just after the war. The population of the old city of Toronto just after the war was darn near 800,000 people. And there were no more housing units.
There were rooming houses in Rosedale.
Doubling and tripling up and dividing up, et cetera, and then they got deconverted again and back and forth. So that same principle for the housing of today, I think, needs to be applied. And I think your example of knockout panels or whatever you want to call it, I'll draw the analogy of when a lot of people buy, say, their first house. Often, they'll buy it with a basement apartment because they can rent that out and subsidize the mortgage. So the same concept that maybe you buy a condo unit that has the unit next door, and that's your basement apartment analogy that pays for your unit, et cetera. There's got to be all kinds of different ways to crack this nut. And I absolutely think that it is a solvable problem. But I also think that when the market demands a solution, it gets provided because people want it. And I absolutely agree that families are needed in the downtown. We need to have back to the public infrastructure to support the families. You need the schools, the community center, the daycare, and all those other things. But none of this is new. I mean, the rest of the civilized world has addressed these kind of problems for centuries. So
but we are too.
We got to do it.
I think the market drives stuff. I mean, at the end of the day, developers are pretty fleet-footed, and they can figure out market trends, or they don't sell their product. You are getting more flexibility built in than you think. And if 900 units shift to 1,300 units, it's because the market's asking for it. So I don't think it's up to the policy guys to decide what housing stock gets built. It's up to the market, and the market will bear out.
It reminds me of a story I wrote a couple of years ago about that condo on the east side of Yonge at the Esplanade. It's the one that has the flat iron kind of front. There are 40 families with children living in that building. And the problems that they have are with the condo board. Because they wanted to, for example, they wanted to put a playground on the roof. That didn't go down too well, apparently, with the condo boards, as well as with the lack of infrastructure for children at Front and Yonge. In any case, we only have a few minutes left, so perhaps we should open it up to the room for comments and questions. Would somebody like to be the first? Do I see any hands? I do. Yes, madam. Somebody has a microphone right behind you.
Thanks. I'm married to a huge transit advocate, so this is going to sound like I'm looking for marriage advice from you, but I'm not. I'm looking for advice on how to retort to my husband's excellent point. He says it's not only about how you raise money, but how you spend it. And he says every year we hear about how much it costs to run the TTC, but we never ever hear how much it costs to run the roads, because to us they're free. Do you have any comment on that, or any marriage advice?
What was the last one?
Any marriage advice? How much does it cost to run roads?
Yeah, well, I don't know about marriage advice, but I can talk about roads. And I think it's a very important point. Roads aren't free. The reality is that the gas tax we pay, whatever it is in this province today, and we all know gas prices go like this all the time, doesn't even begin to pay for about even a third of the cost of building and maintaining the roads in this province. And I think we need to face up to the music of not only roads and transit and all these other things. As someone said, nothing is free. You know, when you look around the world, I don't know if anybody here is from Vancouver, but you know, the lower mainland of Vancouver has a 17 cents per liter transportation surcharge on top of the federal and provincial gas tax, just in the lower mainland of Vancouver. That money's dedicated and goes totally to transportation. New York City, Paris have an employer levy. Los Angeles, many people know, the mayor championed, they had a referendum, a county-wide sales tax approved by 2/3 of the voters in Los Angeles, dedicated for transportation. You know, like, the rest of the civilized world is solving all this stuff. And we got to bite the bullet. And whether, I totally agree, we can find more efficiencies and all those things should be done anyway. But, you know, dare I raise it, but I will. The great casino debate, right? Whatever side you're on, that's not the issue. The notion of the money generated by a casino will solve our transit woes, I'm afraid, is so far from the truth it isn't funny. Whether it's 50 million, 100 million, 150 million a year, we need 2 to 3 billion a year for the next 25 years. $75 billion. Get it through your head. That's how far behind we are. And we got to bite the bullet.
Thank you, Paul.
Can I weigh in for 2
Oh,
seconds?
sorry.
I think first of all, this whole transportation issue, like anything, a business plan is about taking your strengths, aligning it with market needs, given limited resources. And as a city, and Metrolinx has an opportunity, you need a plan. And, you know, Margaret Thatcher was a heck of a visionary. New York was built, Robert Moses was the biggest transportation visionary in the world. He had a problem on his Hudson Highway. He confiscated 10,000 homes to put in the Cross Bronx Expressway. Why? Because they needed it for the city. And there's been a lack of vision. And now we do have a chance with Metrolinx. I genuinely think we're going in the right direction. We have a regional model, so let's get that right. And then once you have a vision, then you need to prioritize. And then, if people can buy into that, the province will step up more. Right now, it's hard to buy into a piecemeal story. Right now, it's hard for the city to decide on a piecemeal basis. So we're never going to get there, Katie, with roads or anything else until we have a vision, a plan against it, set some priorities, and then lock down the province and figure out what they're worth, lock down for the city what it can do, and then the rest of it, you have a plug figure, and it's called some forms of taxation. And ideally, it's user tax. And ideally, you know, toll roads, people say it's not politically palatable. By the way, it's a pretty good way to get there. And maybe none of these things are politically palatable, but that is at least a user fee that makes sense, as opposed to going straight to the commercial guys who don't vote and saying it's 100% on your ticket.
I just wanted to add one thing to Blake's comments. He talked about commitments of the city and the province. Canada is one of the only G8 countries that does not have a national transportation policy for its cities. And it would be nice if, maybe it's because we don't have a plan, but I think it would be really great as well if the federal government was involved, because I think they need to become involved in this as well.
We have a question over here.
Yes, I just want to say thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation. Certainly with respect to the benefits of development and with respect to the fact that we have an impending or current transit problem that's only going to mount, I think certainly from my perspective, I'd say I'm in violent agreement with you. The practical realities are, though, that no matter how quickly we move to resolve the funding and to develop the plan and to start implementing a solution, nothing's going to happen overnight. So I'm coming back to Blake's concept of, in the interim at least, how can we extract greater efficiencies from what we currently have? And when everyone is sitting here saying to me, we're Manhattanizing Toronto, and I'm all in favor of it, why don't we just grow up to the next level and do our roads? Why aren't we all just one-ways? Why are we pretending we're two-way streets and all the grid that goes with it? Let's look to the precedent established by the people ahead of us. At least free up and make more efficient use of the existing infrastructure while we build the infrastructure for the future. Or am I off base?
Blake?
I'll say a couple things. First of all, there isn't a city in the world that gets this right. And, you know, London, you have to go through 2 circles to get from the West End to the city. It's crazy and yet you adapt by educating cab drivers, for example, as to how to get you someplace. And New York, as an island, couldn't be more constrained, but you adapt by doing things like getting the road structures in a grid and getting them to work. And by the way, none of these places are perfect, and London's not going away as a commercial center. In fact, it's on fire. New York's not going away as a commercial center. It's on fire. We can be on fire despite the issues. I honestly believe that to be true.
Are we on fire?
We're getting there. I mean, a lot will depend on the U.S. economy, but talk about a country that survived when 63% of your trading partners been on their knees. Now the U.S. is coming back. I think Canada's in pretty good shape, and I think our country's in pretty good shape, and I think the city's in pretty good shape. We're losing manufacturing jobs. We're creating them elsewhere. I think there's lots of reason for optimism in our city, and there's optimism that we can get this right.
Paul.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic about Toronto. Make passionate love to your city, you'll never go wrong. But the reality is this, and I'm so glad this gentleman raised this business about, you know, it's going to take forever and we won't see anything right up front. I think we've got to learn the lessons from London. When they brought in the congestion tax that everybody knows about in London, what did they do? First of all, they did a lot of advanced planning, but on the very first day that that new tax was in place, they had a massive improvement, visible improvement in the level of bus service in the City of London. All of a sudden, you had a bus always in sight as opposed to one every 15 minutes. And I think one of the smartest things we could do here, whenever this dust settles and we do bite the bullet on whatever new fees are going to happen to fund our transit, is on day one, throughout this Toronto region, we have a visible, huge improvement in the bus, streetcar, GO train service on day one of those new user fees. Because, you know, when you buy a house, generally, you know, you take out a mortgage, most people, but the thing is you get to live in it before you pay it off. The problem here is that we're asking everybody to pay a lot of money for this transit system that will take 10, 15, 20 years, et cetera, before you might see some changes. So I think this business of day one is an important component.
And they don't understand the vision. It's hard to pay into something you don't understand.
But you know,
and I agree with everything you said about the streetcar thing. That we got to.
Oh, I have to come back on that.
That we
But
got
you
to
know
back
what?
up.
We're almost out of time here, but I mean, Blake is right. We need a clearly enunciated vision. And I would say right now, and I dare not mention our mayor's name, but with him around, and you know, we have a variety of visions at play right now. And I think that's another interesting point that we're at that we haven't talked about, is that Toronto is a city on the verge of big change. And you know, people in this city right now feel threatened by change. And I think that there's a certain sort of backlash happening right now, which is represented by our mayor. But listen, we have time for one last question, sorry. Yes, sir, over there in the back. Somebody just to the other side there.
Can't see it.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. Madam, you go ahead.
Okay. Oh, hi. I was wondering if I could get you to maybe comment on the need for school infrastructure to address the needs of the vertical city that we're creating, in at least two regards. One is that at the provincial level, in the funding that is provided to school boards, there is no recognition of this whole vertical city and the density infrastructure challenges that it presents. I'm wondering if you could comment on that. Secondly, I'm wondering in your roles whether you think developers ought to be contributing to the cost of putting in the kind of infrastructure we were talking about for schools, community centers, and so forth.
As they do in Vancouver. Steve, why
They
don't you
do in
talk about
Vancouver,
that?
yes.
Well, it's a very good question, but in fact, developers do pay charges for infrastructure through development charges. Sorry, just let me finish. And they do pay charges for separate school charges. And the reason, but the reason to date that there are no development charges on the public school end is because the public schools have system. They could charge them if they could justify them. But to date, they haven't been able to justify them because of the fact, another gentleman in the room talked about efficiencies, because in terms of where there's school capacity overall of the city, there's areas where there's high capacity and there's areas where there's low capacity. And so what we have to have happening as we grow as a city is there has to be a greater degree of efficiency in terms of the way that the school boards are operating so that there is the appropriate infrastructure. Having said that, I do think that if one of the issues we're facing in the future is going to be attracting families into the core of our city, into downtown, then it's clearly an issue. If families are going to live downtown, they're going to want to make sure that there are schools available. So it's an issue that has to be tackled, but I don't think it's an issue that falls squarely on the shoulders of the development industry. I think it's one that falls on society, and I think it's one, too, that does fall on the school boards as well in terms of their planning and operations.
From the panel?
Can I just make one other very short comment? It's a very good question. We've all just scratched the surface here today. But on this school question, there's two examples that most people will be familiar with that I think are good role models. One is St. Lawrence neighborhood. And if you go down to the Esplanade, you see the schools there with housing above the schools. And we have to get away from this business of, you know, the formula that you must have so many acres for a school and you have to have a baseball diamond of X and this and that and the other. These are urban neighborhoods. You're not going to have room for all this stuff. So you have to look at different approaches and different solutions. St. Lawrence is one model. If you also go to Manhattan, you know, in terms of the lower Manhattan, the new schools that are built there in conjunction with very, very high density neighborhoods have different models to follow. The other one I'll mention is in Toronto, in North Toronto Collegiate. Most of you are familiar, just north of Yonge and Eglinton. What happened there, the school board didn't have the money. They worked out a deal with the developer, allowed them to build pretty substantial high density condos on part of the school property, who in return funded the rehabilitation of North Toronto Collegiate. So there's lots of models, I think, that we need to explore, get away from the cookie cutter traditional suburban mindset.
The only thing I'd add is one of the biggest underutilized resources in our city was land that was dormant until Build Toronto was established to try to unlock the value. The same can be true of the school boards. While they may need new centers somewhere, they're sitting on massive reserves that can be monetized or better put to use elsewhere. So again, it's not always a tax. There are other ways to get there.
On that sad note, we're going to end this lunch meeting. Thank you very much for coming.
Please welcome my colleague, Bruce McQuaig, CEO of Metrolinx and Director of the Empire Club of Canada.
Thanks, Noble, and thank you all very much for coming this afternoon for this event. When I was arranging this and talking to our colleagues up here about coming to this, I didn't realize that so much of the focus would be on transit and transportation, but I will resist the opportunity to comment on that. But thank Christopher and Blake and Paul and Stephen for their conversation with us here today. I thought it was very insightful into the fundamental transformation that our city and our region are experiencing right now, and some of the challenges that we face in terms of building the kind of urban region, the urban amenity, the kind of community we want to live in for the future. But just as importantly, the great opportunity that actually provides for Toronto and the surrounding areas to build this kind of region. So thank you very much for participating in this. Thank you all for coming out for today's event, and safe travels as you go out from today's event to the rest of your workday. I think Noble has a few more remarks.
Thank you, Bruce. And just for our speakers, on behalf of the Empire Club of Canada, I'd like to present, and I'll pass them to you afterwards, a copy of our book. It's called Who Said That? Memorable Quotes, Notes, and Anecdotes, a selection of Empire Club speeches from the last 100 years. So we will pass that to you, and thank you again for coming. Each of you should have at your seats a list of upcoming events. I'm pleased to let you know that we have an amazing lineup of guests and speakers. For example, on Monday, April 29th, we have John Tory, and on Wednesday, May 1st, we have Matthew Teitelbaum, who's the director of the Art Gallery of Ontario. Finally, I'd like to thank the TD Bank for sponsoring our event this afternoon, Fleischmann Hilliard for sponsoring our VIP reception, and a thank you to Mr. Discount for sponsoring our student table this afternoon. Also note that I was remiss that I did not recognize another past president of the Empire Club who was here, Verity Craig. Thank you for being here as well. I'd like to thank the National Post as a print media sponsor. This meeting was carried live and will continue to be carried on Rogers TV. We are very grateful for your ongoing support. We are now on Twitter and on Facebook, and as well, we have our website, which is empireclub.org, where membership to the club is readily available. Thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you again soon. This meeting of the Empire Club of Canada is now adjourned.